American Horror Stories on FX came out with a new episode this week called Feral, and it dives into the phenomenon of feral people who perhaps could live in the national parks, and even suggests that this is why the National Park Service was created. You might recognize that story from basically everything I talk about on this page. So today we're going to dive into feral people, how they're represented in film, some of the real-life examples, and some of the lore surrounding them, the unproven stuff that people simply report. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome to the Lore Lodge. Some of the most recognizable films involving feral people are The Hills Have Eyes, The Chernobyl Diaries, Bone Tomahawk, Wrong Turn, and The Descent. Now these all involve different variations and levels of ferality, so to speak. I don't think that's actually a word, but I'm going to use it. Shakespeare got away with it, so can I. That's how I view it. Point being, there are multiple levels of how feral something can get, how far something has to be removed from modern humanity for us to consider it something different, something unhuman, something near human, so to speak. And for the example of The Hills Have Eyes, what you're looking at is pretty much just humans who happen to be cannibals and mildly inbred. Bone Tomahawk takes it a step further, and you've got probably decades, if not centuries, of inbreeding that have led people to develop all sorts of different mutations, super strength but very low intelligence, other things like that. The Chernobyl Diaries involves radiation and its effects on human genetics and how people change over time. Wrong Turn takes us back to that same idea of cannibals who live out in the woods, except these ones are even more inbred than the ones in The Hills Have Eyes, but that one takes place in rural Appalachia, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Please don't sue me, I'm doing my best. And then you've got movies that go as far as The Descent, which takes you into totally different, subhuman, it's a subspecies territory. In The Descent, you've got the things called crawlers that live in the caves, and as we learn in the second movie, they emerge at night to hunt for deer and other such animals, and when humans do wander into their domain, they end up dinner. But I'm going to open this up by talking about two specific documented cases, and those are the Whitaker family in Odd, Virginia, and the Fugates of rural Kentucky. Now, the Whitaker family is a more recently documented phenomenon, specifically by the YouTube channel Soft White Underbelly, and I want to stress that this is a perfectly, I'm not going to say normal, but this is a perfectly human family. And while they clearly have some mental and physical disabilities brought on by generations of inbreeding, they are completely friendly. They are doing their best. They're very poor, and they live in a very poor area, but their neighbors seem to love and respect them. They actually protect them. And of course, it's rural Virginia, so they're all pretty well armed. And if you try to go there and you try to talk to them without permission, you might be confronted by either the neighbors or even the sheriff's department. So I don't suggest going to look for the Whitaker family. Just leave them alone, but understand that this is something that happens. And essentially what you have here is this family that through decades of isolation, relative isolation, I should say, ended up with a range from people who can physically, mentally have conversations, down to one of the members of the family, Ray, who communicates through barks. Now, Ray's circumstance is interesting because it's clear that he understands English. When people talk to him, he responds and he understands. But he can't communicate himself, which makes you wonder, what his childhood circumstances were like. And then one of the elder members of the family, Lorraine, is perfectly capable of speaking English. Now, it's not hyper intelligent, well-educated English, but it's to the point where you're like, okay, this is a person who experienced human socialization as a child, and they learned how to communicate and how to express themselves. And everything in the family essentially varies between those 2 points. Now, they claim that some of the members of the family graduated high school, but those members of the family also don't talk, so you've got to wonder to what extent they graduated normal high school as opposed to maybe a tailored specialized education program to make sure that people who aren't quite there mentally could still get their diploma. But the key here is to think about the Whitakers as an example of more functional inbreeding, which may be a weird sentence, but it's important to understand that is one of the levels we're dealing with here. And like I said, there's about an hour of content on this from the Soft White Underbelly's YouTube channel. Highly recommend going and watching it. It's very interesting, and he is very respectful, does a phenomenal job here. of documenting this family and talking about them without talking down to them and making them seem like something else. I think he did a great job. I am phenomenally impressed. Another example of inbreeding causing deformities in a family in isolation is the Fugates of rural Kentucky. Specifically, I believe Hazard, Kentucky, although it's also, I've heard Troublesome Creek and a few other various areas, various counties, but the idea is rural Kentucky in the Appalachians. And this family had specifically something that happened with two of the ancestors, who were Martin Fugate and Elizabeth Smith, the progenitors of this family. And they had 7 kids, 4 of whom were born with blue skin. Now, this was due to a recessive gene that caused an increase in, give me 1 second, I really want to try and pronounce this right, but I am not a science boy, methemoglobin. There it is. And this caused another disorder called methemoglobinemia. Methemoglobinemia? Methemoglobinemia? Methemoglobinemia. Methemoglobinemia. There we go. Point is, this caused the amount of methemoglobin to overpower the amount of hemoglobin, which is what makes blood red. So they ended up blue, because as you know, in your veins, your blood appears blue. That's why your veins appear blue. And if I'm incorrect about that, fine, I'm a history person. Argue about it in the comments if you want to. Anyway, over 6 generations, the Fugates continued due to this recessive trait, their isolation, and a significant degree of inbreeding, including at one point, one of the Fugates marrying his biological aunt. Over time, this caused the Fugate family to have an excessive amount of blue skin recessive traits. And eventually this did seem to breed out, but you will still occasionally find people with tinted blue skin in that area of Kentucky who then can be linked to the Fugate family. The most recent member of the family to be documented was Benjamin Stacy, born in 1975, and like the others, he was treated with methylene blue. Methylene blue reduced the amount of methemoglobin, and then as a result, they became less blue. It was isolated to their fingertips, their toes, and their lips. So now that we've kind of established what kind of weird things inbreeding can do to you, let's go into some of the film representations of inbred but still intelligent populations. For example, Wrong Turn and The Hills Have Eyes. Now, these are by no means the only examples, and of course Bone Tomahawk also, I guess, would count because they do communicate, but they're Native Americans out in the middle of the wastelands of the prairies, and it's a little bit different. But, point being, inbreeding in film is often exaggerated to a certain extent to where what's often depicted as a few generations of inbreeding is more akin to what you would get from centuries of inbreeding. And while a population can survive centuries of inbreeding, it does lead to some defects, such as a proclivity towards violence, shorter tempers, a lower average intelligence, and we see this in a lot of isolated places throughout the US, Africa, places like Afghanistan and Pakistan have very high inbreeding rates up in the hill tribes. You see it in isolated regions of Asia. My point here is that you see inbreeding and its effects all over the world, but specifically the US seems to have a fascination with talking about this, and maybe because we don't have as much history to go off of, we like to get a little bit more inventive with the folklore that we do have. Not to say that Native Americans don't have thousands of years of history, but they didn't write much of it down generally. Some of them did, but for the most part, it was oral traditions, so we go very much based off of what we have written down. That's just kind of a white person trait, I suppose. We really like our written history, to the extent that when we did have oral traditions, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, the first thing we did once we had a written writing system was write them down. Because we like to get all of our facts straight, even when they have little bits of fib here and there. But anyway, you do see a lot of that proclivity for violence, and even I don't necessarily know why cannibalism always gets thrown in, but for whatever reason, when it comes to inbreeding, cannibalism always gets thrown in the movies. And maybe there's a proclivity towards cannibalism, but that doesn't seem to be documented in that many of these cases. That seems to be more of an issue of isolation rather than inbreeding, is when you get outsiders who come in, there tends to be some ritual cannibalism involved. And much like the stories of Wendigos and skinwalkers, you get this story that cannibalism is often thought to give you superhuman abilities, supernatural powers, that while it might be taboo, people are willing to risk their humanity in order to gain those, I don't want to call them benefits or advantages, but those benefits or advantages. And of course, things do go further when you get into, for example, the Descent films, obviously based off of something that was totally fictional in terms of what the director and the writer actually said. They said that the crawlers are a separate branch of humanity who ended up living underground for some reason, and over time they basically developed super acute hearing, but also blindness and a very poor sense of smell. That said, it's not entirely unreasonable to look at certain circumstances and wonder if maybe they weren't that far off of the truth. For example, we have the uncanny valley effect, which a lot of people have linked to Neanderthals and Denisovans, and perhaps the fact that a long time ago there were species that looked like humans but weren't quite humans, and we fought with them and had our reasons to be distrustful and whatnot, and over time that was bred into us. There's also kind of the idea that I put forth that maybe this has more to do with the Nephilim of the Bible, or even the idea that there was some sort of pseudo-human apex predator with those features, those sunken eyes, long teeth, pale, gaunt complexion, that over time we have learned to fear. And that is kind of why we have this primal instinctive fear of those specific traits, and why that seems to be widespread throughout all of humanity, not just any one region or specific race. And one really good example of this in modern times is the mystery of the Headless Valley, the Valley of Headless Men in northwest Canada, in the Northwest Territories, in the Nahanni River Valley, where for a long stint of time, an area that was previously pretty uninhabited, the First Nations tribes of the area didn't live there because, as they put it, there were white devils that roamed the forest at night trying to scare people. And when prospectors and hunters of the Canadian and American variety went into the area to try and reap its bounty, they often would turn up headless, and they would be found just missing their head, which is trophy-taking behavior, which is something that is distinctly human. It is something that we do. A lot of animals will consume the entire body, or at least as much of it as is nutritious to them, if they choose to eat something. Human beings, on the other hand, when we fight something, when we get into conflict, a lot of times will take heads as trophies, and that is something that's common in Africa, in Polynesia, in the Middle East, in the Celtic and Germanic territories of Europe, kind of on the fringes of what is considered inhabitable, but it is a common practice for human beings, especially in the early stages of civilization, to take the heads of their enemies. And when you look at sort of what happened in the Nahanni River Valley, where you had prospectors who would go and they would find these massive quantities of gold, and then when they went to kind of pack up and leave, they would either have some mishap where the gold went missing and they went to get more, or they got bogged down by some sort of accident, and then they would be found by people who went looking for them because they hadn't reported in, and of course they'd be missing their heads. And when you consider all the accounts from the Nahanni River Valley, and you can look at my podcast where I discuss this, I talked about a lot of the cases in depth. You can also look at Mr. Ballin's YouTube video on it. He did a really good job with it, summarizing it and kind of condensing everything down to this 120-minute video. So definitely go check that out. But looking at that specific situation, it paints a picture of, we only have the circumstantial evidence. We only have the possibilities involved. There is no hard evidence of a group of isolated near humans living in that region. What we have is an area that the natives have avoided for hundreds, if not thousands of years, an area where prospectors and hunters mysteriously die for no reason, and then are found missing just their heads and none of their, modern worldly possessions. It's just their heads, and occasionally other body parts, but you can probably attribute that to animals dragging them off. Animals don't tend to just drag off the head. That doesn't really happen when humans are killed by animals. And then you have the kind of the factor that ties all of this together with the national parks conspiracy, which is cave systems. And in the Nahanni River Valley, there is a, I think, 10-mile stretch of water on the river where you can see, just going up for hundreds of feet, just caves, just cave openings. And only the lower ones have really been explored, but it seems plausible that these caves could be accessed through the inside that you could climb up to the taller ones, or perhaps even throw a rope ladder down or something like happens in Bone Tomahawk. And then you tie that in with the national park system in the US, where all of these missing 411 cases and a lot of these sightings of things like Wendigo and things that are attributed to be Bigfoot, but are they really Bigfoot? Not saying Bigfoot doesn't exist, just like they don't quite fit with what we're supposed to think about Sasquatch, with the Native American folklore on Sasquatch. And I think in cases like this, it's important to defer to the Native Americans because they've been experiencing this for thousands of years, and we've only been experiencing it for like 200 years. So, I defer to them on the descriptions of what's what. And you have the cave systems. And you have the idea of, perhaps it's the Wendigo that lives here. Perhaps it's something that Noah's flood was supposed to wipe out. Supposedly, maybe it's just feral people who went up into the mountains. And you do have stories of the U.S. Army, of rangers, of, just even prospectors running into people up in the mountains in, like, for example, the early 1900s, who were old Civil War veterans who went and hid up in the mountains and then never came down. And by the time they were found, they were mad and sputtering and just, completely, it took time to rehabilitate them. And you've got the case of Louis Keseberg from the Donner Party, who, when they found him, he was mad and cannibalistic, and all he could think about was consuming more food. Then it took years to rehabilitate him. And you gotta wonder, are we dealing with feral people in these national park systems? Is it possible that, this is the cause of these disappearances? And some of them don't fit, for sure. The cases where somebody disappears silently right from under the noses of their friends, that doesn't seem like feral people behavior. But when it's just one hiker off alone, or somebody who disappears during the night and nobody really hears what happened, when it's the people who will be found miles and miles and miles from the trail, missing clothes or missing just one or two limbs, something like that. When you see how quickly people can turn to this base instinct behavior of must eat, must survive, and it can happen over a period of months. It can be that fast. So just think over a period of generations, when you factor in inbreeding and all of that, how much do we really know? Could we be missing part of the human story here? Could we be missing a big factor of our psychology, where humans tend to very quickly resort to just basic survival instincts? And of course, that's what you get in this new episode of American Horror Stories with the feral people, and that is, it seems like it's just a few generations. And the national park system seems to have been organized in that universe to keep them in one place. And then when they get too bold, they send in the Army Rangers to kind of bring down the population a little bit. And the thing about that specific reference is I know exactly what they're referencing with that. And it's the case of Dennis Martin from 1969, where they had the huge search and rescue effort looking for I think Dennis Martin was between 4 and 6 years old. They sent in this massive search and rescue operation, but alongside it, they sent in the Green Berets. And if you look at this newest episode of American Horror Stories, what you have is a 3-year-old boy who goes missing, and there's a massive search and rescue effort, and they send in the Army Rangers. It is point for point the same story. That's exactly where they got it. I don't have a single doubt about that. That is the Dennis Martin case. But the tack they take with it is, over time, the child who was taken becomes feral himself. And I did not like the way that episode ended. I thought it was a little bit lazy. I think it should have been the pilot for an entire season rather than a single standalone episode. But that's getting off into my opinions on cinematography and script writing and all of that. And that's not what this channel is about. Point being, it's plausible that there are feral people living in our national parks, that there are feral people up in the mountains, and that occasionally when somebody gets a little bit too bold with their camping trip, they might go missing because they were taken. And we never find these people again, which kind of leads you to believe that they were taken somewhere, that they were kidnapped, because as much as you might think, oh, well, it's hundreds of thousands of square miles of forest, you can't search all of it, we find most people that go missing. You've got to consider that. Most of the time when somebody goes missing, they're found. There are 500,000 people that go missing in the United States every year. And almost all of them eventually turn up, either by their own volition or because search parties find them. It's weird when somebody goes missing and we can't even find a body. It's understandable if they go missing and we don't find them until it's too late. But to go missing and completely go missing, that's something else. That's like a Garrett Bardsley situation where the only remnant was a sock. That's a Bart Schleyer incident where, they find a couple of bone fragments and that's it. So it's a Dennis Martin situation where he's never found. And whether you believe that it's something supernatural or something like feral people or just serial killers, it's worth investigating, and it's worth asking the question, why did the National Park Service refuse to give any information about the Stacey Arras case? Why did David Paulides have to fight tooth and nail to get any information out of the National Park Service for something that was an open missing persons case with no suspects, with no foul play suspected, just something that disappeared? It's behavior that screams cover up. It is behavior that screams conspiracy. And no matter what you think about conspiracies, they're constantly given this tag as, oh, that's conspiracy theory. Oh, that's just something cooked up by radical nut jobs to make you distrust so-and-so. Like, sometimes the conspiracy is real. Sometimes it's actually there. The plots to kill Hitler were all conspiracies. They happened. They were real. Benedict Arnold defecting to the British, that was a conspiracy. It was true. It happened. So conspiracy gets thrown around as this term that discredits things, but in reality, you've got to look at the cases in which the conspiracy theorists happen to be right, and there's a lot more than you should be comfortable with when it comes to conspiracy theorists being right. But anyway, this episode's getting a little bit long, so, tune into the podcast. We'll go more in depth about this, and I'll answer questions. That's every Sunday at 7 p.m., and if you want to support the Lore Lodge, you can check us out on Patreon. That link is in the description, as are all of our other social links to TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, all of that. So, check us out there. Keep in touch for our story times. Make sure that if you have a story of your own, whether it's fictional or a true story that you experienced or a friend experienced, send it to us via email at thelorelodge@gmail.com. And I think that is all I have to say for today. Sorry for keeping you so long, but I'm Aiden Madison. Thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.